I think we're ready to get started. My name is Terry Sewell. I'm the Congresswoman from the 7th Congressional District of Alabama. I proudly represent Birmingham, parts of Montgomery, my hometown of Selma, Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Roll Tide for those who are here, as well as 7 counties in the rural Black Belt of Alabama. And it is my honor today to be the host of this panel on Restore the Vote, Election Integrity in the Era of Trump. I know today we have with us some real champions of voting rights, and I don't know if you want to have the honor, our wonderful moderator, Roland Martin, or I can take the honors. You know, growing up in Selma, I've been acutely aware of the gains and those efforts to bring us back when it comes to voting rights. No fewer than 31 states have implemented voter suppression laws since the Shelby decision. I don't have to tell you about the Shelby decision, but most of you know that that Shelby decision in 2013 really issued a clarion call to Congress to come up with a modern-day formula in order for pre-clearance to be effective. So now states can change their voting laws willy-nilly and not have any oversight by the federal government, and it's really unacceptable. And what we've seen is a resurgence of voter suppression laws, everything from photo IDs, and I want you all to know that that 21 million people don't have photo IDs. I can tell you that parts of my district, rural parts of my district, folks don't have birth certificates. They were born by midwives. And so even though the state of Alabama, which has a photo ID law in effect, and they do offer free photo IDs, you still have to prove who you are by purchasing, if you don't have, a birth certificate, which costs $31. And if you don't have a birth certificate, you can't prove who you are. So it's a form of voter suppression. I have the great fortune of also being involved in the efforts to really counter the Trump administration's sham commission called the Commission on Election Integrity. And we're joined today by the Secretary of State for California, Alex Padilla, who's at the far end. Alex also sits on, Secretary Padilla also sits on the same commission, the DNC commission with me, and it's an honor for me to have you here from California. Next to him is Spencer Overton. Spencer is the director, executive director of the Joint Center for Economic and Political Studies. Thank you so much. He also is a dear friend and a former classmate from law school. Next to him is Kirsten Clark, who is Lawyers Committee. She is the president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. And next to Kristen is Vanita Gupta. Thank you. Vanita is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Previously, she was the principal director, assistant attorney general, and the acting head of Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice under the Obama administration. Thank you so much, Vanita, for being here. We also have Leon Russell. Leon was elected chairman of the NAACP at its annual Board of Directors meeting in New York City on February 18th, 2017. He has been a member of the NAACP Board of Directors for 27 years, and thank you so much, Leon, for being here today. I have the great honor of introducing a person who needs no introduction, our moderator for today's hour, none other than Roland Martin. Thank you so much, Roland. You always come through. Roland obviously is a syndicated host of TV One in the morning. I know you just finished your broadcast to come over here, so I thank you for that. And he also is dancer extraordinaire for those who were at our party last night. Roland, it's been an honor for us. This is our 7th year doing this together, and I really am pleased that you are here helping us talk about voting rights in the era of Trump. Thank you very much. Roland Martin.
All right. We all good? We are good. All right, then. Certainly glad to be here. I want to start off this way. It's very interesting when we talk about voting, how I think a lot of people really do forget how we even got to this point. I've been reading Nick Cott's book, Judgment Days. It talks about the relationship between MLK and LBJ. And when we think about how difficult southern locales made it for folks to vote. So when Debbie Wasserman Schultz was on my Washington Watch show, Sunday morning show, and she referenced GOP's efforts going back to the 60s, Republicans lost their mind. They got really upset. But if you look at what the federal judges said in North Carolina, when there was a laser-like focus targeting black voters, when they specifically asked for the data, when do blacks vote, and they came back, they said 70-some-odd% voted in the first week, which is why they wiped out early voting in every place during the first week except one location. So we are seeing what I keep describing as very sophisticated, legal, if you will, efforts, and that's really what they're doing. So it's not as if it's as blatant as it was, where literally poll tax, or you have to memorize the state constitution. But it really is the same in terms of the very systematic effort, and there's no doubt there's a targeting specifically of black people, but now it's expanded to young voters, elderly voters. And so anyone can jump in. We're not going to have a sprinkler head conversation where it's question, answer, question, answer. Anyone can jump in. We'll sort of have that sort of conversation like we normally do on television. If it gets loud, I'll smack your hand. But just from your vantage point, really get folks here to understand how creative and how diabolical these changes are and how they impact. Spencer, you try to jump out of your seat. Go ahead.
I'm going to jump in. So many people say, hey.
Pull that microphone closer, because we're recording the whole deal, so we can make sure we're going to share this with people who are not here. Right.
Today, these issues are political. They're no worse than really gerrymandering here. Back then, it was beating people down on the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge. It was racial back then, right? It was political back then, right? They were maintaining, they didn't say, let's have segregated lines to vote, and we'll count everyone's vote the same, right? They said, you don't vote because we want to maintain political power and maintain white supremacy, right? So it was political then, it was political now, it was racial then, it's racial now.
If I can.
Okay, y'all don't have to ask me to talk.
All right.
Okay. Just go ahead.
So let me add to what you said. You referenced the surgical precision language that was used in the ruling of North Carolina. I'll also offer Texas and others for that matter as examples of, a lot of these laws being challenged in court, being ruled unlawful, unconstitutional, and found to be discriminatory. Not just unlawful or unconstitutional, but the specific finding of it being discriminatory is also significant. So I'll toss that out to the lawyers on the panel here. But I'm glad what you said, because I've been since Charlottesville on a chorus of voter suppression is rooted in white supremacy. So you're absolutely right. This didn't just start with the signing of the Voting Rights Act 50 plus years ago, or just since Shelby v. Holder. This has been going on since the beginning of our nation.
Yeah, and okay, it's kind of chaotic, but that's okay. I want to go back and just do that historical thing for a minute, because I think we get lost in the 60s. Quite frankly, the country was founded on voter suppression. If you were 3/5 of a person, you can't vote. And that was intentional, because we did not want certain people to have citizenship rights, which included the right to vote. If you go to post-Reconstruction America, folks right down the street said, let's criminalize these people and make criminality a reason to take away the right to vote. And in the state where I was born, Virginia, one senator stood on the floor when he introduced the legislation and said, let's keep the niggas from voting. So there is this intentional effort to criminalize our community and prevent us from having full citizenship rights, which I will say continues today when we see a Justice Department that is intent on reinstituting drug enforcement policies that will target a specific community, that will have the result, because of egregious state laws, of disenfranchising more and more people who look like me.
Vanita, before you speak, so let me just add the more context to what Leon just said. So when he talked about a state legislator, when Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe extended voting rights to formerly incarcerated, he did it en masse. Republicans then said, you can't do it en masse, you have to do it individual person. So he began to sign an individual. He went back and realized that the basis of that was in the early 1900s when a white state legislator in Virginia said the motive for this change was to keep the niggers from voting. Why is that important? So since the early 1900s, Virginia has defended that to keep folks from voting. So when people say we're not impacted today by slavery, post-slavery, or Jim Crow, that law was a Jim Crow law. So a lot of these laws go back to that. And so when the governor did that, he said, he said the motive for this was specifically to keep black people from voting. That's why we're getting rid of it. And so I think a lot of times when we're having these debates and conversations, we want to say that stuff was way back then, where literally in 2016, a law that was created in the early 1900s that was solely based upon race was still being used today. That's critically important. Vanita, go ahead.
Well, and just to put a finer point on what you just said is that in striking down the North Carolina law in July of 2016, the Fourth Circuit described the law as the most, and this is a quote, the most restricted voting law North Carolina has seen since the era of Jim Crow. I mean, they just called that straight out. And they said that it was targeting African Americans with surgical precision. It's language that we need to continue to raise up, because this is a thing of what is happening through this administration's voter suppression regime. And it's not just that it started with this administration, let's be honest. The Shelby County decision, as a Congresswoman acknowledged, was a devastating blow. I mean, when I was at the Justice Department, it basically gutted what was one of the most successful federal pieces of legislation and took away the power of the Justice Department to prevent the kinds of laws like Texas ID and North Carolina's law from going to place, and forced great organizations like the Lawyers Committee and the Justice Department and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to spend years litigating to challenge these laws while elections were happening using these laws. Like, we need to remember that Texas saw elections happening over the course of the years of litigation that it took using a law that has now been found to be illegal in one of the most conservative judicial circuits. And so, but we need to connect these dots. And this is where what Leon is saying is really important. This is part of a much broader effort from the administration to kind of undermine our democracy writ large. They're doing it through the reviving 1980s criminal justice policies, which devastated our communities, and turning around long-standing reform efforts. They're doing it through the voter suppression efforts, this Pence-Kobach Commission, and I know Kristen can talk about this. They've instituted a commission basically established to try to prove the myth of voter fraud. President Trump says that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. It's an anti-immigrant agenda that is a deeply anti-Latino immigrant agenda, as well as an anti-African American agenda. It is racist. It is founded, one of the co-chairs is Chris Kobach, who wrote Arizona's SB 1070 law, the Show Me Your Papers law in Arizona that was a deeply discriminatory law. And this is a commission that is laying groundwork now set to purge voters off of the rolls. He went to see the president-elect Donald Trump after he was elected with a piece of paper in his hand that was captured in photo that was a proposal to amend our motor voter bill. The motor voter bill was enacted to try to increase registration opportunities for communities of color. And what he wants to do, he's had a single-minded agenda, is to use this commission to propose federal legislation and state legislation to lower the standard of proof that states need to purge voters off of the rolls. And we can't let that happen. This whole commission is a complete fraud, and I am so proud of what the Lawyers Committee has been doing and other organizations that they're litigating. We're pushing on communications to just expose this agenda, but this is part of a long-standing thing. And Jeff Sessions, after years of the career lawyers in the Justice Department, and I'll close out here, of working for years through trials and hearings in Texas and North Carolina and around the country, is changing longstanding litigating positions. And basically, one of the first steps he took in the Justice Department was to withdraw the claim that Texas had engaged in intentional racial discrimination. And thankfully, the courts didn't stand for it, but this is the kind of concerted agenda that is going on right now, and we all need, the onus is on all of us to organize and stop it from happening.
And stay woke.
Absolutely. Well, let me just jump in and talk a little bit more about this unprecedented and dangerous commission that has already been discussed. I mean, we've never seen anything like this in modern time. I mean, this is the federal government using taxpayer dollars and our resources to mount this national campaign. What they're doing is they've asked secretaries of state, and I want to thank Secretary Padilla for resisting and refusing to turn over any data to this commission. But they are going to every state across the country and asking that election officials turn over data on all of us. Social security numbers, date of births, what party you're registered for. Are you registered in the military? We've never seen anything like this. And they are using private email addresses to carry out the business of this so-called sham voting commission. And the end goal is, as Vanita noted, to lay the groundwork for voter suppression laws. They are attempting to substantiate our president's unfounded claim that 2.8 million people voted fraudulently in the November election. Now, what does voter suppression look like today? There's kind of a playbook, a voter suppression playbook, and I want to make sure that we all leave here today incredibly vigilant about the war that is happening, the assault that is happening on our right to vote. In North Carolina, as has already been noted, they slashed early voting hours, but they didn't do just that. They also eliminated pre-registration opportunities for 16 and 17-year-olds. Raise your hand if you're 16 or 17. You're younger. But in North Carolina, when you hit 16 and 17, you had the opportunity to go on ahead and register so that the day you turned 18, you were able to vote. They eliminated that opportunity in North Carolina. They eliminated same-day registration. They put a photo ID law on the book. In every way imaginable, they worked. They labored to make it harder for people to vote. And that's why groups have sued and have sued successfully. But this war is one that's happening all across the country. Texas. This is the belly of the beast. They put a restrictive photo ID law on the books that basically disenfranchised 600,000 people who had been registered and actively voting, but didn't have one of the limited forms of ID that were required under their scheme: a passport, a driver's license, a conceal and carry permit. If you had a student ID, that didn't work. If you worked for state government and had an employee ID, that didn't work. We have fought viciously for the last 3.5 years against the state, and we are winning. We've won 5 times. 5 courts now have said this law is discriminatory, but Texas keeps fighting back. They've spent nearly $3 million taxpayer dollars to continue defending this discriminatory law. But it's not just Texas and North Carolina. We're also seeing purges of the voter registration rolls. So let me talk to you about what this looks like in Georgia, a small county called Hancock County. Election officials put in place an effort to, quote, clean up the registration rolls. And that cleanup process resulted in the purging of African Americans off of the rolls. In Macon-Bibb County, Georgia, they moved a polling site from a majority black church to the local sheriff's office. Some of this stuff is sophisticated, Roland, but some of it's the same old stuff that we have been dealing with for decades. My hope is that we all leave this room today educated about the assault that is happening on the right to vote and prepared to be vigilant to fight back against the voter suppression that is rearing its ugly head across so many local communities around the country.
So
let me jump in on this purging of voter roll. You said we can jump in. I'm jumping in. This purging.
But I am going to broaden the conversation.
this purging of voter rolls issue, because it is the newest part of the playbook. There's been reducing early voting opportunities, the voter ID, all this stuff. It's not just in one county in Georgia, right? Everybody knows Brown versus Board of Education was a Supreme Court case. Shelby v. Holder was a Supreme Court case. That's right. Citizens United, they got it wrong, but that was a Supreme Court case. There is currently at the Supreme Court a Philip Randolph versus Husted, the Secretary of State of Ohio case on how aggressively they are purging voters in Ohio. If you miss an election, if you just couldn't get out to vote, chose to not vote in an election, Ohio wants to use that as a reason to knock you off the rolls in violation of the letter and the spirit of the National Voter Registration Act. So a lot of us are mobilizing to try to, fight against that, because that could lay precedent for the entire country, not just for one county, not just for one state.
So let me also broaden this. So I'm in the business of words, in the business of communicating, making it simple for folks to understand. Joe Madison of SiriusXM, the Black Eagle, his phrase is, you got to put it where the goats can get it. Most of y'all ain't even come close to the country, so y'all ain't know what that phrase means. Goats they eat off the ground very low. And so I'll say this here, and it's a critique, not a criticism. I believe the critique I have of advocates on this issue is that too much of the conversation is 30,000 feet. This is what I mean. When we have this conversation, the average person, the talk is within the context of presidential and congressional elections. Mm-hmm. What it has to be is, when we talk about purging, we talk about the ID, this is every election. School board, water district, city council, county government, state elections, all of them. So when you talk about shaving folks off and knocking folks off, you have some school board elections where somebody might get elected with only 1,000 votes. All of a sudden, 500, very low numbers. We have to think extremely small. When we hear about some of these examples, people go, oh, there are 200,000 African Americans in Virginia who are not registered to vote. But then when you start looking at some of these local elections, some people are literally winning by 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 votes. And so that has to be understood as well. But let me challenge all of you on this here. How are you also broadening this where we are getting other groups to understand that, Kristen, when you mentioned 16 and 17-year-olds, that's not just black. Trying to get young white voters to understand, young Hispanic voters, young Asian voters, y'all in this too. Trying to get elderly whites, Hispanics, and Asians to understand that when they're attacking with the voter IDs, this is you as well. I think a lot of times this is debated within the prism of black when this is impacting multiracial groups. How are we broadening that to bring in more folks to say, y'all in this too?
Like disabled folks, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
They're really being
Well, so this is where I actually am hopeful here, and I totally agree with you, Roland. I think we haven't won the messaging fight. I think a lot of people in this country still think, what's wrong with having a voter ID? You need an ID to get on an airplane, and we don't. And there's like a.
And remember, this is nonpartisan, but I'm being very clear in terms of who's doing it. From a Republican standpoint, where they've always been great is they use bumper sticker messaging. Yeah. So yes, people go, what's wrong with a photo ID? Because they think everybody has an ID without realizing a lot of people don't, because they don't have to have one. Go ahead.
That's right. No, I think that's, and we have a lot of work to do on that front. I mean, I think this is a work in progress for us to be able to do a lot more serious public education about what's at stake and what the issues are. And people forget history, right? Like but we need to remember the history, but also be talking about how this stuff is playing out in the present. But the thing that I think is also important to remember right now is the Leadership Conference is a coalition of many of the groups that are represented here at the table, but many, many others, about 200 plus organizations, disability rights organizations, LGBT rights organizations, reproductive freedom organizations, women's rights organizations, racial justice organizations, and you name it, labor organizations. And one of the things that we are seeing right now in the age of Trump and a president who has been intent on assaulting our civil rights is a level of solidarity that is being, there are folks who have never, organizations that have such strong ground game, but have never before been engaged in the fight for voting rights and are now seeing this, how all these things are so interconnected. And they're speaking out about these issues. And the disability rights groups are saying we need to work on access to the polls for our people. The Native American groups, there's Native country where there's one polling place for hundreds of miles, and it has had such a seriously disenfranchising of impact. The Latino groups are recognizing the Chris Kobach connection and how this is all connected with a very serious anti-immigrant agenda. And I think we have to continue to build that out and build out that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and do this work, but at the local level, because it isn't, I mean, there are a bunch of congressional bills, and I want to thank the Congresswoman for taking the lead in reintroducing the Voting Rights Reauthorization Act, but we know, the Amendments Act, we know this is a long haul fight. Right. We're not getting that here. We need to keep the drumbeat going in Congress. But meanwhile, there's a lot of stuff happening in the states, and I think it's really, I can't put too fine a point on it, that every election locally matters. We can't just be paying attention to voting rights in the presidential election years. Right. There are district attorneys that are getting elected, and we have seen some seriously effective, reform-minded district attorneys now getting elected because people are understanding that they need to vote in those elections to be able to see changes in criminal justice policy. Local school board, these laws, these restrictive voting laws are getting enacted at the state level.
Yes.
It's not, I mean, here we're dealing with the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision, but we've got to care about who is in our state legislatures and be voting and engage in municipal elections and state elections and in the interim years. And so, and then we have to also recognize that there's other targets. When the Pence-Kobach Commission was announced, folks, the leaders like Secretary Padilla was helping to organize secretaries of state, Republican and Democratic, to say, this is an offense to how we manage our elections, and we aren't going to stand for it. And so folks in our communities, we were organizing campaigns around secretaries of state and these other targets to say, don't do this with our information. Don't do this and expose us. And we had folks deregistering in the thousands in places like Colorado. It's already had a suppressive effect, this commission. But we've got to be working and organizing locally and not just focus on the presidential elections, but also be building these bridges with our communities. Because right now, am inspired by the fact that people are doing that, and we have a lot more work to do to build those bridges and recognize those connections. Because in the end, this truly is about fighting for a just and inclusive America, and that is something that this current administration is fighting against.
Kristen,
we stand for more.
Kristen, imagine if there was a television ad, and the television ad has the photo or some film of Viola Liuzzo. And imagine if the narrator says, Viola Liuzzo was a white mother from Michigan who had her head blown off in Selma fighting for the right to vote. What is happening today is impacting the children of Viola Liuzzo and folks like her. Now, here's why I'm saying that. Because whenever we talk about this issue of voting rights, we are very explicit when we say black and Latino. But then we say other Americans. I think advocates have to be now specific, say white folks, young white voters, elderly white voters. Because what happens is, if we only use black and Latino, folks like, oh, this y'all problem. So I really think from a messaging standpoint, that has to be incorporated in the messaging where it's very explicit. Because in Wisconsin, you speak after this, in Wisconsin, in the last election, there was a clerk who specifically said she was removing an early voting location from a college campus in Wisconsin, and we know it, there are many black people there outside of Milwaukee. Yeah. She said because too many of them vote Democrat.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's right. No, these laws are intended to pick people off at the margins. And as Roland noted, elections in our country are hotly contested, and the margin of victory is often very, very narrow. So it can make a difference if you peel off 2% of the population here, 3% of the electorate over here. Those are margins that can completely impact the outcome of an election. These are laws that have racialized impacts, that have a disproportionate impact on African Americans and Latinos, but you are absolutely right, Roland, that there are poor white people, that there are students, that there are elderly, that there are former military people who are impacted by these laws as well. 5 courts I mentioned have found Texas's voter ID law to be discriminatory, and over the course of that litigation, we presented witness testimony from black folks, white folks, all who had a compelling story to tell. We shared the story of Sammy Bates, a woman in her 60s who lives off of Social Security. She gets a $350 check every month. For her to get government ID, she would have had to pay $42 for a birth certificate. And she said, I can't eat the birth certificate. Every dollar that comes into her home is a dollar used to keep a roof over her head and a dollar that she uses to keep people fed in her home. We presented the story of a former vet who had a VA card that expired 4 years ago, but Texas says not only do you need one of these 4 or 5 government-issued IDs, but it has to have a current date. And so his ID, which expired 4 years ago, he had no reason to renew it, was not enough for him to continue to exercise the most important right in our democracy. So I think you are right, Roland. We need to talk more broadly about the universe of people who are impacted, and students have also been a vulnerable group that we've seen targeted time and time again. Let me just talk briefly about the Election Integrity Commission's last meeting that took place in New Hampshire 2 weeks ago. And white supremacy and how all of that looms over this debate. I mean, we are at a moment right now where we are seeing racial violence and white supremacy kind of rearing its ugly head, and we've seen that in the context of the work of this sham voting commission. They held a full day-long meeting in New Hampshire. There were 3 panels, about 14 speakers. Every single one of them was a white male. No person of color, no woman, no young person was invited to talk about voting and elections. This is an issue that lies at the heart of our democracy. We all have something to say on this topic, but a platform for white men was all that was provided by this administration 2 weeks ago in New Hampshire. So as we talk about these issues, we can't forget that white supremacy looms heavy.
Congresswoman Sewell, again, Again, for me, I'm always trying to tell people the story. And so, again, I also think when we talk about how do you establish a narrative, so how do you beat back somebody who talks about voter ID? Well, I remember one of the debates I had, and the guy had no answer because he had no clue. It's because, so in Pennsylvania, when they passed their voter ID law, well, the top Republican there said, he specifically said, on television, Mitt Romney will win Pennsylvania because of voter ID. It was very explicit. But what was interesting is that when we were debating this, so when this guy was like, oh, Pennsylvania, they supply free IDs. And he thought that was actually going to win. I said, okay, but this is what has to happen. If you don't have the ID, you have to literally travel to the location, sign a form attesting that you don't have it. Then you go back home. Then you have to come back to actually get the ID. So imagine if a camera followed that person who lives somewhere, who had to take 2 or 3 buses, get there, and you have a clock that's running, fill it out, whatever, come back home, wait, then have to go back. Now all of a sudden you say, so you're telling me that this 68, 70, 75-year-old person on disability, they have to literally spend 45 hours or whatever to go through this entire process just to vote when they've been voting for the last 50 years. Now, all of a sudden, somebody goes, wait a minute, they got to jump through all those hoops just to get the free ID? And it's like, yes. And again, the average person is not connecting those dots. They just go, you go down, fill out, you go back home. But if you don't have a car, you don't have those resources, that's a lot to ask somebody. Then that's when they say, you know what, that's too much for me. Again, I think narrative and walking people through that is important for people to go, oh, now I see why you were saying the ID is unfair.
Absolutely. And listen, I think that I often start with a story about my own personal challenge. My father was a stroke survivor, and he was wheelchair dependent. And when Alabama passed its law, he was highly motivated to vote in the 2014 election because his daughter was on the ballot. Now, the thing is that my parents saved for 5 years to get one of those vans that kneel down so that he could just, roll his wheelchair up. But think about all of the folks who don't have access to that kind of transportation. And I think, Roland, you're right. It's about the narrative. When I talk to my Republican friends, colleagues on the floor who voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in 2006, it passed overwhelmingly with all kinds of support for everybody. And I said, why not now? They feel very much like we're picking on their state. We're picking on Alabama. We're picking on Tennessee. And the reality is that if I could wave a magic wand, I would make pre-clearance for every state.
There you go. There you go.
Every state.
There you go.
But even if we limit it, and in fact, my bill, the bill that is trying to restore the Voting Rights Act, is called the Voting Rights Advancement Act. It has 187 signatures, but all are Democrat. All are Democrat. It looks at a 5-year look back, and if the state has had 5 or more statewide violations, not just in the locality, but statewide violations, then you actually are opted in and you must pre-clear. 14 states are captured. States like Arizona, not just Alabama.
Right.
Alabama, Florida, Tennessee.
Before you
yes.
go there, no.
I'll finish my story about
before
my
you do,
dad,
before you do that, but explain to folks that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was not solely Southern states.
No, New
that
York.
Right, so that's what I'm saying. I don't think people understand that there were other states, even some parts of California, that were under. So go ahead.
Absolutely. So to your point, there were 16 or so covered jurisdiction under the original Voting Rights Act of 1965. And they included states like New York, parts of California. But even modern day, 15 or more, 5 or more statewide violations in the last 10 years, and you get states like Arizona. If you remember in the 2016 election, the primary, Maricopa County, Arizona, had, folks wrapped around the polling station. Why? Over the course of the last 4 years, they've systematically closed down polling stations. So you may have had, in the 2012 election, you may have had 800. By the time you got to 2016, you're down to something like 150. So people are wrapped around, and that's a form of disenfranchisement. Precisely. So the point is, we have to expand the narrative. But when I sit there and I talk about my own personal story, the fact that my dad got dressed up in his Sunday best to go to take his photo ID at the local courthouse in Alabama, in Selma, and we get there, we get him dressed, we get him in the van, he's wheelchair bound, we get up to the courthouse, and the courthouse has been, because it's been grandfathered into the ADA laws, the American Disability laws, because it's an old courthouse. So there are 5 steps to get up there. No ramp, didn't have to have a ramp. So then we have to call someone to help my mom and I get Daddy up there. We finally get him up, and we roll over to the one elevator to get up to the second floor. One elevator, out of order. Now, mind you, we're in the courthouse in my hometown, and, I'm standing there, so they're highly motivated to get someone to fix the elevator, because Terry Sewell's daddy's standing there. Okay, so we finally do that 2.5 hours later. Now, mind you, my daddy got up at 6 a.m. that morning.
Do the math. There you go.
That's what I'm talking about. It's all about the hours. We wait another hour and a half for the elevator to be fixed, only to get upstairs, and one person who sits there at the voting registration, and she's what? Out to lunch.
Yeah.
So it took 5.5 hours to get him this photo ID, and he had everything with him. He had the birth certificate, this and another. So there is blatant discrimination that's going on, not just in the African American and the Latino community, but across the board. And I want to acknowledge the students that are here today. Alabama State University has lots of students who are here today, and they're in my district. Stand up. Woo-hoo! Alabama State University in the house. And I want to thank Honda, which is a great corporate citizen in Lincoln, Alabama, for helping to get them here. And I know that we have at least two of my city council members that I see. Councilman Hoyt from Birmingham, Alabama, city council member, and Council Pro Tem. And then we have Sheila Tyson, also from Birmingham City Council. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the Democrat nominee for U.S. Senate to Alabama, Doug Jones. Doug, please stand up. I want to thank you, Doug. You know, Doug was also a U.S. attorney, and he was single-handedly was responsible for capturing the last person, the last Klansman that did the bombing of the four little girls in Alabama when he was on the U.S. attorney. And he's going to be our next senator. But I just say that we have to spread the narrative. We've got to figure out a way where we're not isolating just black people. This is not a people of color problem. This is really an American problem. And we all, if one person who has the right to vote doesn't vote, it affects an election. It just does. And so we've got to get that home. And how do we figure out how do we do that in small sound bites? It's really the challenge.
Secretary Padilla, I got again. Here's another suggestion I have, because again, I'm telling you, it's understanding how these things work. Whenever any of you, whether it's you, Spencer, Christian, Vanita, Leon, even Congressman Sewell, whether it's MSNBC, whether it's CNN, whether it's Fox News, you have to specifically say, Wolf, the next time you talk to Trump, you need to ask him specifically about this. Because see, one of the reasons why this also is not a big issue, I watched all the debates.
Not one question.
Precisely. Because you have to, because again, those moderators, they sit in a room and they get with the bureau chiefs and everybody else, and everything was about emails or foreign policy or Russia. This is also why you never hear a question about education, because frankly, most of their kids go to private school. I'm just being honest. And so I think you have to literally say on air, when you do an interview with Trump, you have to ask him specifically about reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. You have to ask him, will he tell Bob Goodlatte to have hearings in the House Judiciary Committee? Because they have to be put on notice as well, because if they are not putting the pressure on, then it just becomes, oh yeah, that's y'all over there who are asking questions, because even they aren't driving home this issue. Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. What I have done, going back to November and December and in January, every time Trump starts resurfacing these massive voter fraud allegations or millions of illegal votes, and he has called out California, I have challenged President-elect Trump and then President Trump and the whole team Trump. Look, I take voter fraud very seriously. If you've got evidence, bring it.
Yeah.
And to date, nothing. No proof, no evidence. And so part of our narrative—
They even got called out in New Hampshire by their own party saying no proof.
Wait, there's one recent example that surfaced this week of one of the president's own nominees who moved from Virginia to Maryland and apparently voted in Virginia in the November election. So if this administration wants to look at vote fraud, they should start at their own doorstep.
That's it. That's it.
So,
can I take us back?
So part of the narrative—
one second. Secretary Padilla, then Leon.
So narrative is sometimes connecting dots, right? So dot number one, truth about voter fraud, because there have been studies, there have been commissions, there have been investigations, and they all say the same thing. Voter fraud is extremely rare and always very isolated. Number two, let's all remember what we were taught in high school government class. Our democracy works best when as many people participate, not less, right?
Right.
So it's real simple. If you're 18 years or older and a citizen of the United States, you're eligible to register and to vote. And in fact, there's language in the National Voter Registration Act that says the government has an obligation to facilitate people's civic participation. Right. That's why Kobach's going after it, because things like motor vote or other things that we do to facilitate the registration and process for eligible Americans is part of what we ought to be doing. So in a minute, I'll get into not just the bad actions that we're seeing in the North Carolinas and the Texas and the Ohios and everywhere else, but what the counter example is, because that's what I ran for office for. Other people are making it harder to register. How do we make it easier? Right. Other people are making it harder to vote. How do we make it easier? And that's part of our narrative, showing a better way.
Yeah. Can we go back, though, to this issue of pre-clearance and the concept of universal pre-clearance? It's important, but before I go there, to your question, maybe Terry needs to become— no, you won't do it. We need a Jimmy Kimmel of voting rights. We need a Jimmy Kimmel of voting rights to make it plain to folks what is out there. But this pre-clearance issue is really, really deep. It's really deep because it talks about the ability to enforce the right to vote. And when I say that, I'm talking about you have laws on books now. You have motor voter. You have all of the laws. The thing that got bothered was Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we need to fix that formula by making pre-clearance universal, period. Because as long as states feel free, as long as legislators in states feel free to change laws in order to keep people from voting, they will do it. Now, the secondary part of that, quite frankly, is we don't have a Justice Department that will enforce the laws that are on the books now, and that, in fact, is finding ways not to enforce the laws. And first time in 50 years where the U.S. Department of Justice is on the wrong side of voting rights cases. So, I mean, you can say it until the cows come home. Elections have consequences. This election has had some serious consequences that will have ripple effects for the next 10 years if we don't. I mean, we have to think broadly about the process. If we have a Justice Department that is not going to stand up and enforce all people's right to vote, that means they're not going to enforce laws about redistricting. They're not going to enforce laws about reapportionment. They are going to have an administration that does not support a fair census program that talks about how people are counted in this country. We're about to get screwed, y'all.
Well, not about to. Spencer.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
I want to build on Chairman Russell's point in terms of this preclearance. Just being so important, because litigation where you have to get some money, you got to get an attorney, filing fees, costs a lot of money, right? Preclearance, don't have to worry about that. They got to, before they enact it, they got to preclear with the federal government. We have it like an antitrust, we have that concept before a merger. You know, it basically needs to be reviewed by the federal government. Ounce of prevention is certainly worth a pound of cure in this case. Voter fraud, the rarity, just numbers. You know, Joint Center, we're focused on data. 31 cases of impersonation out of 1 billion votes cast here. Over how many? You know, that's since 2000, right? So very, very rare here. Bush Department of Justice did a 5-year investigation, did not have one prosecution. We know voter impersonation, it does not swing elections. You can't provide an example of impersonation swinging an election here in the past. And then finally, it's much more likely that people are going to be excluded, legitimate voters excluded from voting, right? That's the real threat to integrity. So that's the real integrity issue. So North Carolina, they had, you know, one case of impersonation over the course of, let's say, 10 years. And if you look at their restrictions, basically their restrictions would exclude 13,000 legitimate voters to stop that one problematic voter. Roland, Kristen, everybody, I'm a big believer in multiracial coalitions. I think we need to hold up and protect everybody's vote. I'm with you. And you know messaging better than I do. But I think we all need to be concerned as well about black votes and Latino votes and those votes as well. I mean, I think that, you know, Minnesota, in terms of the white woman who was killed, that certainly is a problem. We need to be concerned about her. We need to be concerned about black folk as well. So I don't want, certainly we want to include everybody, but I don't want us to base our argument on you should care because it affects people who look like you.
No, that's why that's wrong. The reality is this here. People in America only give a damn about something when it's personal. I don't care, pick the issue. I don't care what it is. The only reason people are opposing, the only reason people have opposed the Republicans' Senate health care bill, the last one and this one, is because they woke up and realized, oh damn, that's my health.
Yep, yep, yep.
That's it. All of a sudden, something clicked and they like, oh hell, that's me.
Right.
And so, because again, as long as this thing is isolated, where again it becomes, that's y'all black folks voting for it. It's the same reason why I have consistently, for 3 decades, said, white women, you cannot be silent on affirmative action when you're the greatest beneficiary. Is it when Congresswoman Sewell mentioned the ADA, when people hear the American with Disabilities Act, no one ever asks, where does that come from? The 1964 Civil Rights Act.
That's right.
Right.
When we talk about Title IX, we talk about as in terms of sports, but Title IX was not passed about sports. That was about opening professional schools to women, doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors. Who has benefited from that greatly? White women. Where does Title IX come from? 64 Civil Rights Act. So I tell white women, black folks fought for a bill that you have benefited from.
Yep.
So we have to make it plain, because we have to say, white college voters, they are targeting you. White college voters are walking around thinking, oh yeah, that North Carolina thing where they are not allowed, oh, that's for the black kids over there. No, that's you too. And so if we don't make it plain, and they only think it's them, when we begin to make it plain, Wisconsin, 200,000 people were impacted by the voter ID law in Wisconsin. Right. It was a bunch of elderly white people who couldn't vote.
Right. No,
And so I'm saying, when we do that, we have to be explicit where somebody goes, oh, you're talking about me? Yes. Which now means we need you in this. And so if all of a sudden young white kids start hearing that you're being denied the right to vote, all of a sudden they may go, oh, what time is y'all meeting? Because, I mean, I'm getting screwed too. They literally think it's just us.
Yeah.
Just like the reason you have not heard black folks talk about DACA is because nobody wants to mention those from Bermuda, from Caribbean nations, from African nations.
There you go.
So I told Latino leaders the last 8 years, y'all better invite the people of color from those nations to the news conference, so it's not just seen as a Mexican thing.
Yeah.
Again, narrative matters and the face matters. Go ahead, Renita.
Yeah, I agree. I think white folks need to feel like they have a stake in the fight for voting rights. And it doesn't mean ignoring the deep history of Jim Crow and slavery and all of that, but it is a messaging thing, and it's why I think it's really, the New Hampshire example from last week was kind of powerful, because those were white college students that Chris Kobach was saying, oh, there's voter fraud, and it turned out that when the Washington Post just scratched the surface and started to investigate a little bit, asked a few questions and figured out who some of these folks were, it turned out they were white college students. And those folks can get energized and organized around it. And we do have to talk about youth, elderly, people with disabilities as also deeply impacted by voter suppression. I'm going to introduce 2 things, though. And I will say, there have been a lot of litigation victories since the enactment of Shelby County. But Secretary Padilla mentioned something that I'm terrified about. These cases are now going up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hasn't taken one of these recently. They've declined so far, and every time they decline, it's a victory for voting rights. That voter purge case, I'm not terribly optimistic that we aren't going to see a court kind of really lower that threshold.
That's right.
That Texas ID case could end up making its way up to the United States Supreme Court.
Right.
The courts, this is, when we talk about elections mattering, and we're talking about local elections, we've got to also recognize that our courts are being radically transformed right now. President Trump has had the highest number of vacancies than any president in recent history to fill
6 federal vacancies in Alabama.
In Alabama.
Federal.
And just 2 days ago, President Trump's nominee for a district court judgeship in North Carolina is Thomas Farr.
God.
Thomas Farr has spent his entire career defending the state of North Carolina in all of these voter suppression lawsuits, okay? we've got to be paying attention to this. But I hate just talking about the problem. Look, we are
Yep.
in a mode where we all need to be energized and be talking about, we have to get smarter about how we're doing it. We need to make more people feel like they have a stake. But I will say, I'm going to throw out one other issue, and Leon mentioned it, and it's really important. And this is a place where all of us need to be plugging in, because it is the least sexy civil rights issue, and yet it has such huge impact, and that is the census. I want to just talk about this because this relates directly to voting rights and political participation. The census happens every 10 years. It is constitutionally mandated. And the 2010 census was the census. We are constitutionally mandated as a country to count everyone in the country, documented, undocumented, whatever. Why do we care? All seats in the House of Representatives, including the Congresswoman's, are allocated through the census process.
That's right.
State legislatures allocated through the census process. These are the legislatures that are creating these laws. Local boards allocated through the census process. And right now, the Trump administration is underfunding the census by hundreds of millions of dollars, and there has not been a census director put in place to head up the census in the last 8 months. It's going to be the first fully digitized census in 2020. And you know, Congressman Mark Veazey, he is a congressman today because the 2010 census created his district. This relates directly to political participation for communities of color. And we are at a crisis point right now. If Congress does not fund the census through this CR, which is happening right now in real time, we need state and local elected officials and mayors to be demanding that they fund the census, because $600 billion of federal money go into every community, and it is apportioned by the census. So, and that stays with us for 10 years. We've got one chance to get this right. And so as we're talking about voting rights and we're talking about suppression laws and all, this is also, we cannot allow ourselves to be asleep at the switch on this. And we need folks to be talking about the need to be counted for all of our communities. And African American communities, shocking, shock, and Latino communities are historically undercounted. And there's tremendous fear and renewed levels of fear right now about what it means for the government to be asking for information for good reason. But we've got to be out there, and the Leadership Conference Coalition is leading the charge on really trying to fill this void. But we've got to get organized on this, and I would be really remiss if we didn't talk about it.
Just one more again piece to that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Mark Veazey's district in Arlington, Fort Worth. Off of that census, Texas picked up 5 new congressional seats. But because they have a supermajority, Republicans gerrymandered the seats where they took 4 of the 5. So the lawsuit against Texas, which they've lost, deals with, I think, two of those 4 they messed around with. So again, when we talk about voting, when folks did not vote for state rep and state senate, that impacted the makeup of the state legislature, because in 2010 midterms, 16, I remember being on the set that night on CNN, 16 state legislatures flipped where they were either split Democrat-Republican, or they flipped to total Republican control. And in the cases in North Carolina and Florida, they have such huge majorities, they don't even talk to Democrats because they don't need any of the votes. And so that's that's how it trickles down. So we go in census, but the legislature then determines seats. That's determined by who votes. And so all these things are all interconnected.
And Roland, were those new folks Republicans, or were they someone else here?
Latinos said, damn it, y'all took our seats. Because Texas's population growth was due to Latino increase, and what they did was create the seats that were largely white districts, not Latino.
As we look towards the 2020 census, it's not just a funding
Secretary
issue.
Bedelia, then Christian, then Leon.
As we look at the 2020 census, it's not just a funding issue. As we sit here and stand here today, it is also a trust issue. Because if this was a census here right now, and they're going all digital, but just imagine a form was mailed out to every household in America saying, give us all this information, including the names of everybody who lives under this roof, and trust this federal government, trust this administration.
You got that right.
That this data is not going to be used against you in some other way. How many people would not participate? That's exactly what they want, because the census drives federal funding, because the federal census drives reapportionment, which then leads to redistricting and representation, and whatever the balance of this House and the Senate is going to be for the next 10 years.
Absolutely.
So we got our challenge here over the next couple of years. How do we rebuild that trust and confidence among people to be able to participate number one. And it's going to include, by the way, reminding folks that all the data is not shared with the president, whoever he or she may be, until after the 2020 presidential election. The data is not necessarily guaranteed to go to Trump.
Kristen?
So another big case on the Supreme Court's docket this term concerns partisan gerrymandering. What constitutes unlawful, unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering? So that's a big case that we have to keep an eye on, but also I think foreshadows what lies ahead. The 2020 round of redistricting is going to be a game-changing round of redistricting because this will be the first decade that lawmakers are going into redistricting maps for city councils and school boards and state legislatures and Congress without, in many states, being required to submit those maps to the Justice Department for federal review under the Voting Rights Act. So we've got to start thinking about how we can become active participants in the redistricting process that's going to be happening at every level in the next few years. But I want to come back to narrative, Roland, because I think that it is really important that we think about how we shift the narrative and how we talk not about voter suppression, but how we can all become champions for pushing officials in our respective communities to put in place reforms that make it easier for people to vote.
Yep.
Let's stop talking about this mythical vote fraud which doesn't exist and talk about the reality that in so many communities, participation and turnout rates are far lower than they should be. We need to be bringing pressure to bear on officials to do a few things, and let me tick off some reforms that I think we all need to be talking about. Same-day registration. One of the states with the highest turnout rates in the November general election, Minnesota. Why? Because in Minnesota, you can register to vote on Election Day. Bring anything that you need to establish your eligibility to the polls, and boom, you can register and exercise your vote when it matters most, on Election Day. Same-day registration is something that we need to champion in communities across the country. Automatic voter registration. When we go to DMVs, when we go to local government offices, and we're turning over all of these documents, our social security card, our birth certificates, why not have those government offices transmit all of that information to their sister election office and automatically add people to the registration rolls? We all need to be championing simple automatic voter registration for registration across the country.
Chris, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second because I want you to do the whole list because it's important that we have this affirmative. Automatic voter registration, it was like a non-existent thing several years ago, and now there's been such great momentum at the state level. Illinois, bipartisan, Republican governor signed automatic voter registration into law. There are about 10 or 12 states, I think, that now have automatic voter registration. That's where we need to be looking for solutions at all levels of government, but this is a really important reform.
Right.
Now, add this, okay? Again, I need y'all to have the even deeper context. So North Carolina, prior to 2008, was in the bottom 10 in terms of voter participation. When Reverend Barber and others and other coalitions changed and added a lot of these things, they saw the highest turnout in North Carolina history.
Right.
That's what scared Republicans in North Carolina, and they immediately began to change it. So they saw high turnout and went, oh, hell no. And that's when it all started in North Carolina because of this. So I'm making that point that if you even get it put in place, you got to fight to keep it in place because some folks don't want to see high turnout for that reason. Go ahead.
That's right. Okay, two more quick things. Early voting. There's too many states that don't have early voting. You go out North Carolina that got early voting, but we need to be pushing for early voting opportunities across the country. Too many people can't get to the polls on Election Day because they can't get time off from work. They've got childcare responsibilities. So expanding early voting opportunities so folks get that opportunity to cast a ballot in person is really important. And then lastly, I want to just bring it full circle. We talked about the racist origins of felon disenfranchisement laws. These laws are a stain on democracy. 1 in 13 African Americans cannot vote because of these racist laws that sit on the books in many states. There's going to be a ballot initiative to help cure this problem in Florida, where about 1/4 of African Americans have been disenfranchised by these laws. When people have served time and completed their sentences and paid their debt to society, they deserve a second chance. And giving them the opportunity to have a voice in our democracy and giving them the ability to exercise the most sacred right to vote, I think is really critical and something that needs to be a part of our narrative about how we expand voting access in our country.
Leon?
I think it's very important for us to think locally and statewide, because we tend to think that Congress has the answer to all the questions. And I need us to do a little bit of government 101. Congress can pass laws that impact federal elections, but most elections are state elections, and they are governed by state law. So the obligation to fix stuff really is a local obligation.
Right.
It's a state obligation, and we have the onus on us to be the ones who lead that charge. So yes, at the federal level, we need to do all of those things that will help enhance the law, but we have to remember that the action takes place in state legislatures, which takes me back to the importance of the census. And I want to talk about digitization of the census. And listen, y'all, I'm all up into doing the modern thing. I believe in...
That's the setup to I don't like the modern thing.
Doing automation, but let me tell you what. Look at what's happening. Look at what's happening. If you digitize the census, you have the issues that are over here that we talked about, the folks who are going to be skeptical about how you use the data that's input. But we've already seen where certain communities can get left out of the planning process. So if your city in Mississippi, and I can't remember the name of the city, but if your city is left out of the process, your 10,000 folks don't get counted at all.
And we also have seen hacking with all of this electronic stuff going on. I'd love to hear from you, Alex, about what your state's doing. But I think that we have to think about all this digital stuff also means a possibility of cybersecurity.
Yeah, but we also have to think about it. I'm looking at my people. They will answer questions and provide information to people they know in their communities. And that is it is extremely important that this census be as accurate as possible for all of the reasons that Vanita outlined before. So we have to be very closely scrutinizing these things. And the other side of that coin is, I live in Florida, where 1.3 million people are disenfranchised because they are formerly incarcerated persons. And I want you to understand the history of that. Before we got our current governor, the previous governor had put in place a system that provided for quicker re-enfranchisement. On the day that our current Mickey Mouse governor was inaugurated, on the very day that he was inaugurated, he instituted an executive order that required the whole process to take up to 7 years. He put that in place on the day he was inaugurated. Elections matter. How we do elections matter.
So I want to comment on the cyber piece, but I also want to add one more of the reforms to Kristen's list, because yes, I'm proud to say in California, we've gone not just to online voter registration, but we have automatic voter registration. We have never really had in-person early voting. We're moving to that in California, 11 days of voting up to and including Election Day. We're building on vote by mail. More than half the state votes by mail now in each and every election. And we have now implemented, not just on paper but online, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. Because I know when I was a senior in high school, I was thinking about financial aid applications and the prom. Right? So pre-register folks, and ahead of time when they turn 18, you're automatically on the list, you're ready to go cast your ballot.
That's right.
All consistent with what we've established already. Voter fraud is extremely rare, non-existent. Number 2, our democracy is better when everybody participates. Number 3, government has a responsibility to facilitate civic participation. This is the direction that true Americans should be working in. But let's also kind of break it down, because we all know in this room who it is that tends to be eligible but not registered. Who it is that tends to be registered but not as regular voters as the best voters. When we get more people involved, the electorate better represents the people and who gets elected as a representative at all levels of government, and the policy will follow. And so I'm glad there's a lot of young people here, because we're going to need your help in working, to reach out to your friends, your family, your colleagues. On the cyber piece, here's what gets me, and it's not just about this commission and their invasive data request. The fact that the intelligence community of the United States is unanimous in that the Russians interfered and attempted to undermine last year's elections has been established. Yet we have a president and a White House that continues to deny it or to refuse that. And as much as we still got to get them to acknowledge what happened in 2016, every day that goes by that they continue to deny is one less day that we have to prepare for 2018.
That's right.
Because whether it's the Russians or anybody else, they're going to keep coming. And so it's a shock to me that of all the things I was hoping to do as Secretary of State, 2 things that I never anticipated. 1, to get into a Twitter war with the President of the United States. But we checked that box real quick.
Big ass child.
And number 2, that aside from reaching out to colleges and universities and political groups about registration and voting, that we are interfacing with the Department of Homeland Security and FBI as often as we do because of these real threats.
So Vanita earlier mentioned, she talked about solutions. And so I want to ask the panel about this. So 4 years ago, at the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Ohio State Rep. Alicia Reese announced their plan for an Ohio Bill of Rights. Because they've been fighting this whole thing back and forth. Of course, you had 2012 where you had local voting commissions where they had different hours. They were extended in Republican areas. They were cut short. Democratic areas, the Obama campaign, others sued them, and he had to admit, yeah, this wasn't right, and they changed it. So they announced this idea of having an Ohio Bill of Rights. It's a ballot initiative. They need 350,000 signatures. They've got 150,000 already. Total budget is about $1.5 million. They've raised about 30,000. It is totally grassroots shoestring. So, but here's what's interesting. Labor unions have been missing in action. The ACLU just announced they're going to spend some $30–40 million on these initiatives, but they're not supporting this one. This could very well, everything that you said, Christian, if they pass this, this now goes in the state constitution. For folks who don't understand the historical piece, in the South after slavery, you did not have publicly financed education in America. Freed slaves were elected to legislatures. They pushed that through. It was put in state constitutions after the Great Compromise of 1877 when Jim Crow came into effect. Guess what? They got rid of all the advances of black folks during Reconstruction except that. So the reason you have publicly financed education in the South is because black folks had them put in the Constitution. So I think what Representative Alicia Reese needs, she needs advocates telling the ACLU and the others, y'all trying to create something that they've been working on for 4 years. If they are able to get this on the ballot, and get it passed, then all of these issues in terms of commissions and times, everything else, not having the same fight, same legal fights, they need help. And what's interesting is you have folks who are not paying attention. They've gone through all the hoops, the language, certified by the Attorney General and everything, and they have been looking for support, and it's literally sitting right there. If they are able to get those signatures, it could literally be on the ballot in 2018 or 2020. And we remember what happened in 2011 when the Ohio legislature passed the voter suppression bill. They got more than 300,000 signatures. They got enough to put on the ballot in 2012. The legislature freaked out and repealed their own law because they knew they were going to lose because of the ballot initiative. This is one where they need advocates telling these other funders, y'all get behind this. It's already in Ohio.
Yeah, I will just say there's a lot of conversation afoot about the Ohio one because there's ballot initiatives in Florida, in Michigan, do you know all the full roster of the states? I can't remember the full roster.
I have Michigan here. I have, Florida as well. Because House Dems want to vote a Bill of Rights, add to the Michigan Constitution.
Yeah. So there's a lot of conversation about what's happening in Ohio and a lot of dynamics there that folks are actively engaged in. And I think it is important right now that there are a series of ballot initiatives that are going to matter for other ballot initiatives in other states. Like, we need to be successful on these. And there is a tremendous opportunity right now. And there are folks willing to put more money in than they had been before this election, before the 2016. That's where the ACLU is getting its money from. And it is entirely grassroots. And so we hear you loud and clear, and there's a lot of work happening right now.
Okay, but here's what I want, because I've known about those.
I'm getting a homework assignment.
I've known about those conversations. There have been people who have been critical back and forth, but a lot of folks who've been. I know some of the folks who've been critical, but they put nothing on the table, and so not. But here's the other thing. The other thing is, this initiative has 1,200 volunteers already, and they've been working it 4 years, and they're saying, okay, y'all telling us, well, I don't like this piece and that piece. They're saying, fine, refine it, but at some point, they got to get the signatures. And so that's sort of where they are. And also, let's be clear, this is also a Black-led effort. And let's just be real honest and frank, that's also a problem for some of the people who are complaining because, well, we don't like how this is done, but these folks have been putting the work in for 4 years. And so that's where we are. So we need to be pushing this because, again, we can argue all we want to. We can argue about change this in Congress, but if you have ballot initiatives, we saw what happened with affirmative action in Michigan, in California. Ballot initiatives have been successful. We simply haven't used them because it's so costly.
Wait a minute, some of us haven't used them. I live in Florida. We've done 3.
Right, I got to. Well, some of us, but that's one state, and that's a special state too. So we ain't gonna really get about Florida.
Don't go there.
But we have to. But again, this is a method, and just let me give you an example, because I need us to understand our power. So in 2011, when Congresswoman Marsha Fudge had me do the Divine Nine, our Black fraternities and sororities, a panel with all 9 presidents. And I specifically asked them about, at that point, the ballot initiative to repeal the voter suppression law. None of the presidents knew what I was talking about. And so Congresswoman Marsha Fudge, she's like, okay, move on. I'm like, no, I ain't moving on. Because she was like, is he really doing this? I'm like, you had me moderate. And so I jammed them up. I said, all of you are talking about your voter initiatives. I said, but you got one sitting right here that you've done nothing. And so it was like silence for about 20 minutes, and I kept pressing them. The next day, they met, and they calculated how many chapters they had in Ohio alone. The next day they said, Roland, you made us really uncomfortable. That's familiar. They said, but we went back and added up. Black fraternities and sororities alone had 120 chapters. In Ohio alone. If each one of those chapters made the commitment to get 1,000 signatures, the Divine Nine alone could have supplied 1/3 of all the signatures needed. Alicia Reese hit me 2 days ago because I've been slamming them hard on this and pushing them. The AKAs in Ohio have committed to using their chapters to get these signatures. The point I'm making is this. Look at you. Look at you. Now follow me. The point I'm making is this here. When we have these initiatives, we keep asking, well, what's the NAACP doing? What's the Urban League doing? You got the largest committee there in court, Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, they're in their court, they're battling. But we have infrastructure right now that is untapped, that's not being used. And so if it's a ballot initiative in Florida and one in Michigan and one in Ohio, and you take our existing infrastructures, we're not sitting here begging and pleading. We could literally do it ourselves without the help of anybody else. That's how I need us, when we leave here, thinking about, wait a minute, what group do I belong to, and how are we as a group involved in these efforts? Spencer, go ahead. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to talk about the importance of ballot initiatives. I mean, one of the reasons this is such a sticky area is that incumbents often benefit from particular rules.
That's true.
And the ballot initiative kind of takes that off the case because the voters are actually making the decision and you're not relying on incumbents to vote against their self-interest.
Yeah. But let's be clear. Ballot initiatives must be coalition efforts. They have to be collaborative efforts. And NAACP is in this room. You heard Roland just go through that litany. Connect the dots, NAACP folk. I told y'all. Anyway, that's a special message. I'm sorry. We need to understand about ballot initiatives. They have the power to change things. But we have to understand the legal process of ballot initiatives in every state. Right. Because we did some successful ballot initiatives in Florida. One of them, fair districts, we put into our state constitution requirements for the redistricting reapportionment process. As a result of that, our state legislature went back and changed the requirement for the number of votes that were required. It went from a simple plurality to 60% requirement. 60% of the voters had to vote in favor before the initiative could go into effect. Got to be very careful. Got to use the process correctly, and you got to kick some suckers out of office.
So let's also go through, so I want to deal with specifically solutions in terms of folks leaving here. So I'm going to go down the line, and I want you to offer a minimum of one, a maximum of two, because y'all going to have homework leaving here. And so I'm going to start with Congressman Sewell, you first. Two things you want folks to do leaving here when it comes to this issue. It can be on any point or whatever, just two things for people to do.
Okay. First, I'd like for you, especially if you have Republican senators or you're represented by Republican congresspeople, to get them to sign up and be a co-sponsor of the Voting Rights Advancement Act so that we can restore to the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
So stay right there by a raise of hands before you continue.
All right.
I'm going to ask the question. How many folks in here know specifically who they're, no, let me rephrase that. I don't want you to say that Congresswoman Sewell, that's my girl, that's my Sarah, that's my homie, she's my member of Congress. No. Who is your and this is not to embarrass you, but it's to point out, who knows exactly who their member of Congress in terms of the House is? Who represents them?
All right.
Okay.
Fully informed.
Not everybody didn't raise their hand.
Now, that's a problem.
So I'm going to let you finish, because here's what happens. Folk come to D.C. and say, I'm from Alabama, we going to see Congresswoman Sewell. But she may very well not be your member of Congress.
That's right.
It might be a Republican. He or she needs to see you as well, because tell folks what happens when somebody walks in and says, hi, I am one of your constituents. Mm-hmm. Let them know what happens. They get a different audience than I'm from Alabama.
That's right.
Now your second point.
Okay. So I would love for the Divine Nine and the NAACP, we have to take a coalition effort to inform ourselves of the legislation, and I'm going to have my staff raise their hand because we have a toolkit to help those grassroots organizations that want to champion the Voting Rights Advancement Act, trying to get the restoration of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Staff members, raise your hand. All right. You see my staff, they can get you guys the toolkit to do that. That's my first thing. I would hope that people will galvanize around trying to restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have to put pressure on Congress because Congress, according to the Shelby versus Holder, we're the only ones who can come up with the formula, a new formula, to a modern day formula, to make sure that we get the full protections again.
And the authority.
And the authority again. So that's why putting pressure on your senators, these are the same folks, by the way, who in 2006, so just 11 years ago, voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for 25 years. And now all of a sudden they don't. It's a hypocrisy. So that's my first thing. My second thing is,
this really your fourth thing.
oh, sorry.
I'm keeping up.
It's so nice that it's
your first one had like 3 parts.
It's nice to be the hostess, right? It's nice to be the host.
Don't think I didn't catch that. Like a Baptist preacher closing.
Well, you know, I can't really close without acknowledging the fact that my mother and my aunt just joined us. Mommy, stand up. My mom and my auntie. From Selma, Alabama. Okay,
All right.
So the second thing I'd like for you to do is to promote one of the 4 things that Kirsten talked about. And I would champion automatic registration. If we could get folks to our states, our local and states, to promote automatic voter registration when you're before state agencies and get all that information, that is the key. So thank you all for coming.
Spencer, you're 2.
Voting Rights Advancement Act, 2,
Okay.
oh, this is new? It's got to be new. Okay.
No. Does it have to be new? Voter rights advancement, what the hell does that mean? That's too broad.
Okay.
I want specific things that people can do. This
So-
is homework.
Okay. Call your member, call Congress, the main number, give them your address if you don't know your member, and talk to your member and ask them to support
Okay, you ain't got to
the Voting
call
Rights
Congress.
Advancement.
Go online. You can type in your zip code and address. It will tell you exactly who your member is, and then call that person. Okay, so I'm going to give you an extra one so they can Google that themselves. Nice try, Spencer. You would think somebody who wrote a book on the issue of voting can have 2. And he's a damn professor. Why does he not understand homework? Because he used to, come on.
I just give homework. I usually don't get it here. So, turnout in local elections important. You know, you remember Ferguson, right? You remember national election? Blacks and whites voted the same. In that following local election, white folks were 3 times more likely to vote than black folks, right?
In a city that was 67% African American.
Right? And all these issues are local when we talk about economic development, policing.
Hiring police chiefs, all that.
Your court fees, all that stuff. And just a quick note, there are a lot of other Fergusons because 2010, for the first time, more black folks in metropolitan areas lived in suburbs than the center city, right? So there are places around this country where there's a real mismatch, in part because of the turnout issue. You know, federal Democrat national parties don't have the money to invest in terms of turnout. We've got to get ourselves out in terms of these local elections.
St. Louis mayoral election turnout was 28%. Birmingham, they have a runoff right now. That turnout was around 18 or 20%. The last election for Atlanta mayor was 14%. And there's a very, very strong possibility that this year, in about 2 months, we will see the first non-black mayor in Atlanta in 2 generations because literally lack of voting. Next up, I will go to
Point of
Leon,
personal
your
privilege,
two.
I gotta also acknowledge the first African-American woman to be DA in Bessemer. Please stand up, Lenise Washington. All the folks from Alabama who are here. Love you.
Is there anybody else you're going to acknowledge in Alabama? Anybody else?
All right now.
Anybody else? All right.
All right.
Leon, your two homework assignments.
Two homework assignments. First one, real simple. Vanita
Actually,
represents.
hold on one second. Doug, don't go anywhere.
Yep.
My person's going to interview you for my show, so don't leave.
Do not leave.
That's free FaceTime, so don't go anywhere. And I talk to black people. You want to talk to them. Leon, go.
Vanita heads an organization that represents over 200 organizations that are committed to all of the things that we talked about in terms of improving our ability to cast an unfettered vote. Go out, join one of those organizations, but more than that, get involved and do the things that are necessary to support what that organization is doing.
Vanita, give them the website where they can look at the organizations.
Civilrights.org, www.civilrights.org, and we
Leon?
will connect you, everyone, a bunch of these groups that are at this table are part of it.
Leon, number two.
Number two is real simple. Y'all go out and join your local branch of the NAACP. We'll take care of giving you instructions about what to do after that.
Gotcha. Leon.
With a life membership.
All right, Leon, give them. I know you scared of digital, but give them the website.
www.naacp.org.
Got it, Secretary Padilla.
Two items. One, doesn't matter if you have automatic registration in your state or not. Each one of us can go home and register 10 more people to vote. Right? We got to act. We got to mobilize. The other thing, and then I have a quick explanation on something.
Some of y'all are not writing, taking notes. I told y'all this homework. Students, I don't know what y'all doing. Y'all typing in y'all phones? This for y'all too. Girl, you ain't remembering all this. Stop it. Go ahead, Secretary Padilla. Go ahead.
So the other thing is, we can all give a little.
Mm-hmm.
We can give a little bit of time,
Yes.
Yep.
or we can give $10,
Yep.
or whatever it is, to NAACP, to Lawyers Committee, to ACLU, to Planned Parenthood, to a political candidate you may support. Not too many. You know, we all like to talk, and a lot of us even like to work. But whether it's an organization or a campaign or a candidate or a ballot measure, we need money to qualify, we need money to campaign, we need money to win. And we can all give a little. Last thing I want to say, because I know we're sort of wrapping up, the simple elegance of automatic voter registration. If you're eligible to vote in America today, 18 years old and a citizen, but not registered, you do not get your state's voter information guide. If you're eligible to vote in America today, but not registered, your county does not send you the sample ballot.
That's right.
If you're eligible to vote in America today, but not registered, chances are campaigns are not knocking on your door.
Yep.
That's right.
So the sheer systematic registration of eligible voters puts them in the mix. The voter information guide comes, the sample ballot comes, and at least the smart campaigns are going to start knocking on your door. And that's how we move the needle on not just the registration numbers, but the turnout numbers, so we have an electorate that better represents the people.
Vanita. Vanita.
Okay, I'm gonna get three, but I'm gonna do them short. I'm gonna take really little time. Okay, so one is, I think it's important for everyone to know who their Secretary of State is.
Yes.
Because, and here's why. Whatever comes out of this sham commission, and if it's allowed to continue, it will produce a report that will then it will get fanned out, and it'll be hyperinflated and full of false information. Your Secretaries of State actually have final say-so over what kinds of rules they're going and who they're going to purge off of their voter rolls. Get to know them and tell them you're watching, so that you're a part of that process. This is a kind of an elected official that, or in some places appointed, where folks don't often know who those are. You know,
John Merrill in Alabama.
So I want you, because
I've had him on my show.
they need to know that we are watching what's happening. The second thing is become a part of a complete count committee, These are local committees that are operated, they're going to come out in almost every part of the country to ensure a fair and accurate census. And they need to have membership and representation from all of our communities. The census.gov website has the map of where those complete census committees are, and we need to start getting engaged because we know that one of the defunding issues around an underfunded census is that they're going to undermine all of the partnership, the government-funded partnership community organizers that go out into communities to talk about the census. We need to fill that gap, and becoming a part of a complete census count committee is one way to go, and it's really, really important, and the leadership conference will help connect you as needed. Sakira Cook, my colleague here, has a whole thing of 5 things you can do on these issues, and so see her as well because she's got a list. And the last thing I will say, and it's to underscore what Spencer said, which is we need to vote in local elections. And the other, we have 30, I think it's 34 or 36 governorships that are up in 2018.
Yeah.
So we need to be,
got
let me
about
tell you
20
something
you got
about
about
that.
20 mayoral elections that are major between now and May.
In between now and May, and then we need to be worried about the House in 2018. But here's the thing, I want to scare you with something and tell you why you need to be engaged in 2018. If there are a critical mass of one party represented among the governors, and right now it is already heavily skewed Republican.
31.
We've got so many governors in place, these races in place, that they could form a critical mass to amend the Constitution once they
that's the scary
have.
thing.
And this is no joke. There are now finally articles getting written about what's at stake here. There's stuff we're seeing happen that was unimaginable, right? You could have imagined the President of the United States refusing to condemn white supremacists in Charlottesville. So let's not refuse to imagine what could happen if people do not vote in local elections, in state elections, and in 2018. We cannot just be focused on the 2020 presidential election.
That's right.
Question.
Okay, so pull out your phone. I want you to plug in a number, 866-OUR-VOTE, 866-OUR-VOTE. The Lawyers Committee leads the Election Protection Program, which is the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection program. And through this 15-year effort, we have been fighting to safeguard access to the ballot box on behalf of Black folks, Latino folks, students, elderly, white folks, all across the country. If you know somebody who has a problem registering to vote, someone who wants to report voter suppression, someone who has a problem on Election Day, call that number and you will get legal support provided by folks on the Lawyers Committee team or through our vast pro bono network. I'm going to ask the Lawyers Committee staff in the room to raise their hand. If you want any information about the Election Protection Program or the work that we're doing to safeguard access to the ballot box, connect with any of the folks on that team. Last year, we reached 150,000 voters and would-be voters across the country, and sometimes those complaints resulted in lawsuits that we filed across the country that impacted the rights of tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. So report voter suppression when you see it. And I want all of you to be involved and engaged. This is an opportunity for each of us to reach unregistered people in our communities. So connect with the Lawyers Committee so that we can help you launch a National Voter Registration Day effort in your community. Finally, if Roland will let me, we are engaged in the fight of our lifetime right now. What we are seeing in terms of the attacks on our civil rights by this administration is simply unprecedented. We are suing this administration on many fronts right now in courts. All of the organizations on this table are stepping up and pouring blood, sweat, and tears to make sure that this administration doesn't turn the clock back fully when it comes to civil rights. So it's really important that you reach deep and support the work of these organizations engaged in the fight. Bypass that fancy dinner once a month and donate to support the work that we are doing. It's so critical. If we don't fight at the end of these 4 years, we'll be in a far worse place. Thank you.
Kristen,
Sorry.
what did I tell you?
That's all right.
No, she knows. You forgot something.
Oh,
Go to www.lawyerscommittee.org and click on the donate link to find, to donate and support our work today.
Y'all need to understand, okay, on at least half a dozen occasions, I've told Kristen, look, every time you on TV and radio, give the damn website out to ask for money. And so she did everything but tell you where to give. She asked you to give, but didn't say where to go. I said, so I'm teaching Kristen, like like at church, never let money walk out the room, Kristen. You can't do that. All right, I got one. It's very simple before we shut this down. That is, everybody belongs to something.
That's right.
You have to ask your members of whatever you belong to, whether it is your church, whether it is your fraternity, your sorority, your social group, what exactly are we doing when it comes to the issue of voting? Now, your 501c3 status, tell people stop lying, will not be in jeopardy if you are helping folks register to vote. Find out the laws in your state, in your county, what that means. But you can at least do that. And when you do that, the next piece is then say, how are we organizing caravans to drive people to the polls on election day? That's all. That's my only ask of you. We literally have infrastructure that exists. The reason I keep harping on Divine Nine, because out of all the groups that I've had on the shows and I've studied, the most sophisticated infrastructure in our community, more so than anybody, no disrespect, Leon, more so than even NAACP, is because you have international, national, regional, state, grad, undergrad, and we have, of course, our youth programs as well. And literally, because see, what folks don't realize, Leon's the chair of the board, but the local president has a lot of authority. Absolutely. When the Alpha president says, do this, all Alpha chapters have to abide by that. And so again, we literally are leaving our power untapped and unused because we are not forcing our infrastructure to be better utilized. You said Tuesday is National Voter Registration Day. Reverend Jackson's been in Virginia. 200,000 unregistered black folks alone in Virginia. 800,000 or so unregistered in Georgia alone. 2.1 million eligible unregistered Latinos in Texas. Literally, my point is this here: if white voter turnout stays the same, if you increase black or Latino voter turnout by a third, that could flip a significant number of elections all across the country. That's why that matters. Thank again our panel, folks.
Yes. And help me thank our host, our moderator, Roland. I want to thank you all for another awesome panel. And I love the fact that all of us have homework. And I just want, as I said before, it's really important, as the young folks say, that we stay woke. And I think especially on the issue of voting. So please, make sure that you've taken your notes and that you actually amplify your voice by telling others. Thank you all for participating.
Cool.
We're working hard in Arizona.